Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to the second of a series of webinars that have been organised by IPEM's Clinical Scientific Computing Special Interest Group. My name's Bob Weller. I'm a clinical engineer and I lead on clinical scientific computing at Leeds Teaching Hospitals. Today's seminar will be about medical device security. And I'm joined as well by my colleague, Patrick, who will introduce himself in a second. So the way that things are going to work today is Patrick will give a presentation around connected medical devices, and then I'll follow that with a presentation about network segmentation and the use of firewalls and our experiences at Leeds Teaching Hospitals. And then we'll lead into a set of questions and a discussion maybe at the end of the webinar. Could you go to the next slide, please, Patrick?
I can. There you go.
Oh, we've done that one all right. Can we go to the next one?
Yeah.
So in terms of housekeeping, I just wanted to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the IPEM's YouTube channels after the session. We'll also be using Slido for Q&A. So you can either access Slido through the Zoom interface, or you can also use Slido through the website. And I think James is going to drop the Slido reference into the chat of the conversation so that people can enter questions onto Slido. So I think that's introduction. Let's move on to Patrick's talk.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm Patrick Moore. I'm the consultant clinical scientist in the clinical scientific computing section of UCLH. So I'm going to give a talk on sort of the general overview of connected medical devices, the issues, and then Bob is going to do probably the more interesting bit, the practicalities, how you can use it. So we'll get off. So for basically just start with what does a medical device look like? So you've got your traditional medical devices, defibs, patient monitors, infusion pumps, fetal monitors, imaging devices, ultrasound, ventilators. These are all purpose-built sort of medical devices. They do have software in them, which we'll come on to in a minute. And then you have got the dedicated sort of software medical devices, which are based around possibly some high-end graphics capable PC, possibly even a tablet device, software running on there, an all-in-one medical grade by the bedside PC can be quite powerful. Smartphones, you can get apps that run on smartphones that are medical devices for sure. And then our old favorite, the Excel spreadsheet, which is Excel itself is not a medical device, but if it's used in a certain way, a particular spreadsheet could be deemed as being a medical device. So I'll very quickly run through the regulations because I'm sure we all know about these. So the original ones were the Medical Device Directives 93. I've highlighted the bit here in terms of any instrument, apparatus, appliance, or software. Because software became its own sort of medical device with a later edition. And the thing I always remember if I'm trying to decide if something's a medical device is, does it do diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, or treatment? And then, of course, in 2017, it was updated, pretty much the same, not much change. So why do we network medical devices? So what we used to have was lots of paper notes, handwritten by doctors, plain film X-rays, and lots of paper charts. And then we had the bedside charts where readings were manually transcribed by the staff at regular intervals, and this obviously changed on a regular basis, and that hung on the end of a bed on a nice clipboard. But then big systems, electronic health record systems have come along, such as Epic and Cerner. They're not by any means the only large electronic patient record system, but they are two of the biggest. You have smaller systems such as the IntelliView system, which is used more locally for places like intensive care and probably theatres. Electronic prescribing systems, PACS systems, which have been around for quite a long time. One of the original reasons for networking medical devices. And then here we have a dedicated sort of form of PACS called Viewpoint. So lots of different IT systems around. So I'm now just going to take you a little bit on UCLH's journey and how we transitioned to a new EHRS very quickly. So what we did have, this blank space here is representing lots of different systems that held patient data, not all linked together, not any one of them particularly authoritative. We did have a separate electronic prescribing system. We've had a PACS system for quite some time now. And then we had the patient bedside monitors, and their readings were put onto paper charts. So then come 2019, I think it was, we implemented our Epic system. So what were the changes when we did that? So the first thing to go was the paper charts by the bedside when we implemented an automatic means by which the patient readings were automatically sent into Epic using a system from Capsule Tech. The other thing to do with the bedside monitors was occasionally they needed ECG traces. So this went the not paper anymore. This went via another system called Muse from GE, and that went into the Epic record. The electronic prescribing system went because that was all part of Epic. The PACS system was linked into our Epic system. And Epic became finally the source of truth for patient information. So any patient lookups were done via to Epic. So for the patient monitors, for the GEMU system, and for PACS, all with the same reliable patient demographic information, which was a big change. None of this required new devices. So all the devices that we connected had existing hardware connections, good old D types, USB connections for some of them. So it didn't mean that we had to throw away all of our old kit and get new kit. We bought new, we used existing kit. These all connected to these data aggregators. So within intensive care, you'd have a bedside monitor and a ventilator connecting into one of these devices. And then that would transfer its information using fixed Cat5 connections. It was capable of Wi-Fi, but our Wi-Fi isn't particularly good, so we didn't use it, but it could do that. So on to the sort of cybersecurity issues, really. So back starting in 2014, the issue started to become highlighted in the news, in the media. Medical devices vulnerable to hackers. Could hackers target your life-saving medical devices? Ransomware will get worse. Hackers targeting whales, medical devices, and IoT. And then they start to talk about numbers. Initially dozens of devices, then thousands and tens of thousands. And then in 2017, our good old friend WannaCry hit, and that really, really changed the landscape. It was quite a wake-up call for lots of people. It did significantly impact on some organizations. I was at a neighboring organization for my daughter's dental x-rays, and I had to view it on somebody's iPhone because their entire network was just gone. So what are the problems when it comes to medical devices? Well, a lot of medical devices are based on Windows, believe it or not. This is even your traditional hardware devices. Significantly, older versions of Windows. So Windows 98, I would hope is gone by now, but I wouldn't be, completely certain it's still not around in some form. Windows 2000, we got rid of our last ultrasound, which had a Windows 2000 OS only a few years ago. Windows XP, we still have devices on our network which are based on XP. Windows 7, and then Windows 10, believe it or not, is going to be an old operating system within about a year. October 25 is when Microsoft pulls support for that one. And then, of course, there are devices that use Linux. I've seen quite a few of those. Android is certainly beginning to make its presence felt. We use Apple devices, Apple Macs for image processing type applications. So all of these are present on the network. So what are the threats? Standard threats, really, depending on the device. Phishing attacks would be probably more applicable to those devices that have internet access, or you can check your email, which would rule out a lot of traditional medical devices. Internet worms, of course, they affect anything that's on the network, and they haven't gone away. Your man-in-the-middle attacks. This is obviously where you've got some of your services running outside of the organization, and you've got the potential where somebody can, pretend to be who they're not. Organizational sort of denial of service. And then supply chain, which is becoming quite a popular one. So if you use a particular supplier for, to run your services, the hackers are now targeting those companies as a means to get into your organization through a back door, in a way. And at last count, this was actually about a year ago, there's about nearly 140 known big, hacking groups. These are sort of nation states to sort of independent groups, but there's lots of people out there who are trying to get into your organization and get your information. So what do we do? Excuse me. Cross our fingers. In some ways, yes, to an extent, we are doing a bit of finger crossing at the moment. Believe it or not. Sort of closing your ears to it or running out the door in panic is obviously, another approach, but not really a good one. Or do we disconnect everything from the network, which, to be honest, is not really feasible. So what we do is we obviously implement measures to mitigate the risks. So in general, how are IT networks protected? So you have, in most organizations, a perimeter firewall, and in the cases where WannaCry, was quite, impacting on organizations was where they had a very poorly controlled firewall external to the organization. You can run antivirus on systems, but you can't run antivirus on your traditional medical devices. You can't run antivirus on a CT scanner, for example. Your other protection is that you install updates when they're available. But back to the WannaCry is some of the ultrasound machines that we use. They are obviously strictly controlled medical devices, and they couldn't be updated until the manufacturer actually supplied the updates, which took, in some cases, 6 months. So, you install updates when you can, but sometimes, the big problem with medical devices is that they can be delayed. You can operate network intrusion detection systems on your network. I mean, traditionally, one of the problems with these sort of systems is that they need a client to be installed on systems, which you can't do with medical devices. But I'll come on to some of the more modern systems a little bit later. And then this is just something that Bob is going to sort of cover in a bit more detail, and that's segmentation of your network. So, extra levels of protection. So what you're trying to do is to stop any hacker that's getting into your organization from moving through your organization. Trying to limit or sort of slow the spread, definitely. Yeah, so those are the sort of standard means. So why is it a problem? Well, as I've already mentioned, your traditional medical devices, you need your patches from your supplier. But these patches can arrive months after any known exploits, and if they're vulnerabilities that make something susceptible to internet worms, that kind of thing, then you're running a risk until you get the updates from your supplier. Traditional medical devices obviously unable to run AV, although I've had the case where some of the suppliers will, for a CT scanner particularly, they'll supply an antivirus, but they'll supply their own antivirus. But they'll only update the definitions once a year when they come and do a service visit, which is obviously not a great deal of use. And you certainly can't install any sort of extra agents, such as intrusion detection agents, on these devices, or traditional medical devices. Uh, Software medical devices obviously do have the problems as well, in that even though they run on standard PC hardware, if your supplier of your medical device software says you can't install patches or antivirus, then you can't. I mean, they may restrict or delay again the installation of patches. So some suppliers will say they've got to check it first, which could, mean it's a month or two before you can install patches. They may limit the use of AV. So one of the big problems for antivirus running on any device really is the real-time scanning. So you can possibly suspend real-time scanning, but obviously that leaves you vulnerable. As this, any sort of changes potentially could invalidate the CE marking, or as it is now, UKCA marking. So I'm just going to run through very quickly some NHS guidance, which has been recently published on network segmentation, which is quite interesting to look at. So I'd recommend anybody sort of searches for this after the meeting. So they obviously give a good argument for network segmentation, the rationales why you do it. Options for segmenting the network. I'm not going to go into this in great detail because this is the sort of thing that Bobby's going to cover. How you how you focus your segmentation. Sort of do you segment IT devices, IoT devices? So like building management systems, that kind of thing. They're on your network. So how do you deal with those kind of devices? Then you've got IoMT, Internet of Medical Things, and then you got other technologies. And it talks about things like stateful firewalls, router switches to achieve the network segmentation. It's got a lot of best practice. One of the things it does obviously advocate is the need for an inventory, and obviously we're doing that currently with DSPT, but an inventory that specifies those devices which are network connected. It talks about highlighting your functionality. So one of the ways you can segment your network is by functionality. Then he talks about sensitivity of the particular devices, criticality in terms of business criticality. So if you can't run your imaging devices, then that's going to significantly impact on the organization. In terms of how it communicates is another consideration in terms of how you can segment. Connectivity requirements. And then it talks about the 5 diagnostic pillars, which are, in this case, genomics, imaging, pathology, endoscopy, and physiological measurement. Although I was on this site last week and I couldn't get anything on the last two, so it looks like it's not complete. But it's certainly worth a look at. Right, I'm just going to very quickly talk about AI sort of based intrusion detection systems. When I sort of started looking at this when I was working with with NHS Digital, as it was then, Armis was one of the companies. But since then, quite a few new companies have started out. You've got things like Solera. Palo Alto was again an original one. Medigate. So these were the first 3 that I was made aware of. But since then, you got Solera, Scenario, an order and numerous ones. They're popping up all the time. I'm regularly getting contacted by suppliers. So what do they do? So they allow agentless network identification. So what they do is they tap into your core network switches and look at the packet traffic that's going around your network, so that from inspecting the packet traffic, they can determine what devices are on your network, what it's doing, where it's going. So in this, with using these kind of devices, you can get visibility of data pathways, which is very useful. So one of the things that you do in terms of trying to determine sort of if you're being attacked is, first of all, you want to start by what is normal. So these kinds of systems will allow you to take a snapshot of what is normal within your organization, which devices can communicate to which servers, for example. So if obviously something starts talking out to the internet, which when it never did, that could be, an early detection of a compromise. And then they give you real-time threat intelligence. So they're linking into all the sources of threat intelligence for medical devices, and they will identify which particular devices on your network, are the subject of compromises potentially. So it gives you an indication as to where to concentrate your effort. Right. So that was the intrusion detection system. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the cyber assessment framework before I finish. So the cyber assessment framework is going to eventually, I'm told, going to replace the DSPT returns that each trust has to give every year. And it starts by at the top level, you've got four objectives: managing security risk, protecting against cyber attacks, detecting cybersecurity events, and then minimizing the impact of cybersecurity events. So I'm going to go into one of them, which having had a reasonably good look. It's the only one I could really find at the moment, which may affect sort of medical devices on the network. So each of the objectives then goes into further detail in terms of service. So principle B1 is service protection policies. B2 is identity and access control, data security, system security, and then B5 is resilient networks and systems. So I'm going to go into principle B, subsection 4D. And so this is the typical page for each one of these. So in most cases, you only have not achieved and achieved. In some cases, you have partially achieved. So on the left here, you have, if at least one of these statements is true, then you've not achieved this particular principle. Here, you need all of these to be true if you've partially achieved, and if you're fully achieved, you need these to be true. So the ones I see as being problematic is obviously this one here, where you've got it talks about patching of your devices, which obviously medical devices are going to be problematic. So this is one which could impact the organization's ability to pass the cyber assessment framework. Maximizing the use of supported software, firmware, and hardware, which you've got some control of. But again, if you've got old systems on your network that you can't get rid of, that would obviously impact on that. And then one which would potentially lead to a fail on this particular principle, and there are many of them. If the organization is not pursuing replacement for unsupported systems or software, so this may be a push in the organization to get rid of your older devices and replace them with new devices. So that was just a very quick overview of the cyber assessment framework. I was hoping to get somebody from NHS England today, but it seems like they're still not completely over their reorganization, and nobody was able to attend today. So just in summary, obviously medical devices, they do share the same vulnerabilities as PCs when they're networked. There are differences due to regulation in terms of, how you can apply patches, you can use antivirus, that kind of thing. Obviously, if you handle your medical devices on the network, there is great benefit to the care of patients. A lot of the standard protective measures apply, except where they don't, in terms of, so that you don't break the CE certification. So, things like antivirus you can use in some cases, patching, obviously you do when you can. And when you've got passwords on devices, you need to make sure that they are complex. So this is just a slide on that it's from 2022, and it just sort of highlights the need for complex passwords. So down here, you've got number of characters, you've got numbers only, up to about 12 characters, well, up to 11 characters, it's no challenge, and even greater than that, the maximum you can get from 18 characters, a couple of weeks on a brute force attack. To over here, when you've got numbers, upper and lowercase letters and symbols, you're talking in terms of potentially trillions of years, billions of years. So I try to pitch mine around here. So by the time anybody cracked any of my passwords, I'd be long gone. So it's good to know. So that's my final bit. We're not going to take questions now, but I think we're going to open Slido, aren't we, Bob?
Yeah, Slido. So it's accessible either through Zoom, the Zoom pop-in. If you look at the chat, there's a link to it. Or also in the chat, there is a link to the web-based Slido session that we've got open for this. So please just drop any questions into there and we'll pick them up at the end.
Okay, so that's my bit.
So hopefully we can swap over sharing and I'll...
So I'll stop sharing my screen.
So I'm hoping you can see my slides now. Can you see those, Patrick?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, in fact, let me move on a little bit. So I'm going to talk about the network segmentation and how we secure network segmentation. So initially, a fairly simple presentation of what is network segmentation and why we should segment our networks with connected that have got medical devices connected to them. And how we can secure this segmentation. And in our case, we use network firewalls for doing that. And then talk a little bit about our experiences in Leeds. So what we've done in Leeds, particularly in radiotherapy, and that's I'm using radiotherapy because it's kind of one of my background areas, but also I think we've done most segmentation here in Leeds around radiotherapy because we've really identified that as the highest risk area. What do we do on a daily basis, or to keep it going in Leeds? We've had segmented networks, I think, for 18 years now in Leeds, and then yeah, the experiences from that 18 years of segmentation. So basically, what is computer network segmentation? So if we just think about a computer network and what it is in principle, is that what happens is we set up a network and we start connecting typically some computers and some servers to that network. And we were doing this, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. And then we had a few more computers and a few more computers. And then what happened is we started to connect our medical devices to these networks. And it's great because everything is simple to do and everything works, all very straightforward. But unfortunately, should we get some malicious software on one of the computers, it doesn't matter which one it is, that malicious software can see all of the activity, all of the traffic that is going up and down on that network. And in days gone by, we might have had viruses spreading over that network. But increasingly these days, that malicious software will sit there for days or months or years, just learning about the network and learning what's going on that network. And of course, if it can see all of the traffic, it can learn about the whole network. Now, in reality, I'm sure all of the organizations that we're working in have got the networks that are actually segmented, and they're segmented into what we call VLANs. VLANs is a virtual local area network. The way that the datacomms departments manage the network, the physical network is really the connectivity, and within software, the network infrastructure is virtualized. And what that means is the datacomms departments can separate the physical location from the establishment of these segmented networks. But if we've got network segments that are split up and then connected together through routing, to some extent, when we get the malicious software sat on one of these computers on that network segment, if we've got critical medical devices mixed in with normal IT systems, then that malicious software is still going to, although it might only learn from part of the network, it's still going to learn about some traffic and some communications that we really don't want to be exposing to it. So what we should be doing is we should be applying some logic to our segmented networks. And what I mean by that is we should be segmenting our networks, in this case, based on functionality. So we have a standard computer network with laptops and computers talking to servers, maybe reading emails and connecting to the internet. And then on a separate segment of the network, we maybe have an imaging network. And on a separate segment, again, we might have a radiotherapy network. And we don't want to mix these things together. Now, clearly, they do need to talk to each other, so we do need an element of routing between it. But by simply separating the network out into those segments, we've reduced we've reduced the risk of malicious software. So when we've got this malicious software sat on the standard computer device, it's not monitoring the software, monitoring the traffic of our more, shall we say, critical systems. Why should we segment our networks? Well, the first thing is certainly if you're in England, is that NHS England tell us that we should be doing this, and you can log on to these web pages, and it'll describe. I think these part of this is what Patrick was talking about. It tells us that we should be segmenting our networks. And what that does by segmenting our networks, so it creates smaller network segments, smaller network segments of assets grouped by defined criteria. And certainly here in Leeds, the approach we've been taking is to group it by functionality. We can limit the access only to traffic authorized by an approved security policy. So we can put things in between those segments. So we can use network access control lists on the routers. We can put firewalls in, which I'm going to talk about today. And more recently, there's an emerging area of software-defined networking. And I've got to admit, I don't really know much about that at the moment. So what this does, this segmentation, is it increases the difficulty for an attacker to reach their goal once in the network. It doesn't eliminate it, but all of these things is about reducing risk. So it adds a mitigating factor. And I'm not sure I like this terminology, but it talks about limiting the blast radius of a cyber attack, mitigating the lateral spread. So there's one thing about increasing the difficulty of an attacker to navigate a network, but then there's a separate issue about when something does go wrong, the impact of that cyber attack can be limited through network segmentation. And it can limit this by containing the network within each network. Sorry, containing the traffic within each network segmentation. It can reduce the attack surface, and it limits the adverse impact of the cybersecurity incident. It may actually, as a side effect, make the networks run better, improve network performance. Now, as Patrick mentioned, there's the emerging cyber assessment framework, and it's certainly a requirement within that framework, so it will enable compliance with that. And also it is in the DSPT, the Data Security and Protection Toolkit, which is our current submissions that we have to do every year. And this year, I don't know if you've seen this year's questions, but they specifically ask about the segmentation of our networks that contain medical devices. So why should we segment our connected medical device networks? Well, last year's webinar, we did a presentation about the Irish health service network that was affected by a cyber attack, and it closed down services across the whole country for some days. Certainly the radiotherapy service was closed for 6 days. You can actually watch the webinar as a sort of plug here for last year's webinar. So there's a link there to last year's webinar, and if you haven't seen that, it is well worth the watch. So this describes how a cyber attack affected the whole Irish health network and took services down for a long period of time, and some critical services down for a significant period of time. Following on from that cyber attack, there was an investigation carried out, a national investigation, and this report has been published. And this report does highlight that the National Health Network, the NHN, was primarily an unsegmented or undivided network. This is what the report says, and it can be described as a flat network to make it easy for staff to access IT applications, the IT applications they require. And we see this quite often, is the approach on simplicity makes it easy to implement, or easier to implement and easier to use. But the cost of that is it also makes it easier for malicious software to access and propagate throughout an organization. So how can we secure our network segments with a firewall? So I mentioned about our logically segmented network. This is the slide that I put up previously, and certainly what we do in Leeds, as well as having a peripheral firewall around the edge of the Leeds' computer network, we also have internal firewalls. So we simply add a firewall between the router and our logically segmented networks. So in this scenario, we've got a firewall sat between the radiotherapy network and the rest of the hospital, and we've got a firewall sat between the radiology network and the rest of the hospital. So firewalls, been around a lot of years, pretty straightforward. I'm sure most people have got them implemented in one way or another. So fundamentally, we might have a situation where, as a CT scanner, it needs to talk to a PAX DICOM server. So there would be outgoing traffic, typically using port 104, and it would travel across the network, and we'd let it straight through the firewall. But we'd specify that it can only talk to the DICOM server that we want it to talk to. So we try and be explicit with firewall rules about what the source is, what the destination is, what the port is being used, and also the type of traffic. Another example is that we might have a remote original equipment manufacturer, so a company like Philips, for example, and they may need to access the CT scanner to provide remote support. And again, we'd use the firewall to let that traffic through. Typically, in our case, we use port 5600 and 5900, and that traffic is allowed through the firewall, and it can access the CT scanner. So the firewall is protecting both ingoing and outgoing traffic. What we wouldn't want to see is somebody sat on a general hospital computer and trying to write to a file share that was opened up on the CT scanner. So we'd block that with the firewall, and we'd stop that communication happening. And similarly, we wouldn't want somebody sat on a CT scanner opening a web page and accessing the internet. So again, we would block that port going out to the internet. So the firewall, although it's fairly simple to manage, it does give us a lot of control. In reality, what we do is we block everything with the firewall, and then we add exceptions to the connections that we do allow. So our medical device segment firewalls are extremely explicit about their connections. So in Leeds, what have we done in Leeds? So we started looking at this actually when we'd been hit by a cyber attack around about 18 years ago, and at the same time we were relocating the services into a new hospital. So we use that as an opportunity to completely redesign our network security for radiotherapy. And the approach that we decided to take was that we would use a high degree of network segmentation, and we'd implement basically as many layers of network defenses that we could implement. So obviously there's a hospital firewall sat between the hospital and the outside world. Manufacturers will supply firewalls, intruder detection systems and intruder protection systems, IDSs and IPSs. So we would use those wherever they were available to us. Operating systems, so Microsoft Windows, Windows Server, Linux, they've all got built-in firewalls. And again, we're going to turn those on and we're going to implement them whenever we can. And of course, the network segmentation segment firewalls that I mentioned earlier. So we're going to use our segmentation and firewalls to mitigate other cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So Patrick mentioned about the fact that we can't always patch our medical devices. In fact, most of our radiotherapy devices we can't patch, and we can't run antivirus, or we certainly on most systems we can't run it. On some systems we can run it, but not with real-time scanning, and sometimes we can't update the signature files of the antivirus. So we've got other cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and what we do is we use our firewalls to mitigate those vulnerabilities. And we apply both inbound and outbound controls on our firewalls. So we also took the approach to provide independent protection for vulnerable devices. So for our most vulnerable devices, what we decided to do is say, well, instead of just having a devices, for example, for linear accelerators, we could create a segment for all of the linear accelerators, and we could put a firewall between the linear accelerators and the rest of the hospital. But what we realized is, and we experienced this when we first just in the incident that I mentioned 18 years ago, is that once one linear accelerator had become infected, they all became infected, because in effect the malicious software was in the segment, and it just spread instantaneously across all of the different devices. So we decided to create segments for each individual device. That's evolved a little bit over time, and I'll mention that in a short while. And we wanted to control. Sorry about the typo here. We wanted to control and have visibility of our network segments. So we're a medical physics department, and we're working closely with the datacomms department. The datacomms department own and manage our networks and our firewalls. But by collaborating with them, we've got oversight. We can see what's going on. We can access those firewalls. So this is how we configured the radiotherapy network at Leeds. And if I start off in the top left-hand corner, you can see that we've got all of our linear accelerators. And nowadays, the manufacturer, Alexa, they actually provide what they call an NMAS system, which is a kind of a mixture between an intrusion protection system and a firewall. But that comes as a manufacturer supplied product. So they've put everything in their own network segment, but we put all 12 of those into a radiotherapy treatment segment, along with the computer software that is used to manage radiotherapy. So in effect, we've got 12 segments inside a bigger radiotherapy segment, and each of the devices is separated from each other. But if you look across the top line there, you can see that we've got 3 CT simulators and an MR simulator, and that we put all of those in separate network segments, all protected by a firewall, because the manufacturer supplied system is not as robust as the Elekta and MAP system. And then we have a separate network segment and a separate VLAN for brachytherapy and gamma knife radiotherapy planning. And then we have some general systems that we don't protect with a firewall that are more open. So in effect there, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 network firewalls that we're managing as part of our radiotherapy system. Just to mention at the bottom there is you can see that we actually serve out the applications onto the hospital network over Citrix. So the only thing that actually leaves the medical device networks in terms of general computer access is a Citrix session. So what does what do these firewalls look like? So I've taken a picture of ours in a rack there. So it's sat downstairs in the server room. It looks like a bit of network equipment that plugs into the rack. We use a Cisco ASA 5525X. It's coming up to end of life itself. I think it's about 8 years old. But what it does is it's not particularly fast. It's certainly been adequate. Throughput of 1.1 gig, so it's not a really massive network speed, but the performance has never been a problem for us, and we run multiple firewalls on it. It works as a redundant pair, so in a separate room there's another one, so should it fail, it will automatically switch over to the other one. It runs multiple logical interfaces, so this one device, which is relatively inexperienced, here at Leeds we've got 28 logical firewalls running on that one device. So for us, it's good value for money. And as I mentioned earlier, we have shared read-only access with the Datacoms department. So this is what, this is what the interface looks like for us. It gets a bit dated, but it certainly serves its job. And the way that we manage the thing and the way that we configure the thing is we define a host. So there's a host. It's just a network IP address and a host name. We cluster those hosts into groups to make it easier to manage. So we try and apply the IP address, sorry, the firewall rules to groups where we can, and we apply the rules. So you can see there, typically in this case, what we're doing is we are permitting TCP port 104, which is generally DICOM traffic, to pass from the source, from the CT console to the destination, which is a collection of DICOM servers. One thing that is worth pointing out is if you can see here, there is a rule that we've set up on our firewall, and there are no hits on the firewall. And the ability for us to say, well, we can see this as well as Datacoms. What we can see there is we've configured something wrong here. This is an error in configuration, and that's why there's no hits showing up on that particular rule. So how do we maintain our firewalls at Leeds? First thing mentioned already, you've got to work really closely with the Datacoms team. We segment on functionality, not physical location. So we use the VLANs, the virtual networks, and we focus on what is this segment doing. And certainly with the granularity of radiotherapy, we've got a segment that says, we are doing treatment planning for radiotherapy. That is the segment. And another segment is radiotherapy treatment. On a bigger scale, it might be imaging modalities for radiology, and that might be a function to segment on. We certainly don't segment on physical location. When we do the segmentation, we put a lot of planning into it because we try and minimize the traffic. So what we're trying to do is base the logic around the communication that's going on, so that most of the communication is not passing through the firewall, through the segmentation, and then the exceptions are passing through the firewall. It is absolutely essential that we've found that somebody's monitoring the firewall. So we work very closely with Datacoms, and they've got alerts set up on the firewall. So when things happen that are unexpected, we are instantly aware of there being problems. And I think one of the other things to realize is these are not static systems. They are not something you set up and walk away from. There are changes going on all the time. I think we change our firewall configuration probably every 2 or 3 weeks, and that's just with the developments that are going on with the systems. The manufacturers are much better nowadays. So when we first set this up, the manufacturers were not very willing, and I'm not sure they always knew what network ports, what network traffic was flowing in and out of their devices. But these days we're finding that they're much better, and they can provide lists of all of the communication that's taking place, what the sources should be, what the destination should be, what ports we should be opening for that. Sometimes some of these rules can become highly complex, and as I pointed out earlier, we don't always set it up correctly. One of the benefits that firewalls help us with, and we certainly saw this with the WannaCry virus that Patrick mentioned, is that when something does happen, it's very quick. We can step in and change a rule and lock down a port based on that particular threat. So what we've learned here is it's complex to set these things up. It's complex to make changes to the network. So best achieved during installation and upgrade. Misconfiguration is common and a frequent cause of problems. So we are introducing configuration errors at the point of making change, and we've got to balance that against cybersecurity, which I mentioned here. So it's a balance between complexity and cybersecurity, and we chose to go with cybersecurity. What I would say is don't rely on the manufacturer's supplied firewalls or intrusion detection systems, intrusion protection systems. They're often unmonitored. And the second thing is that they often only provide incoming controls, and they assume that malicious software will not be coming out of their devices into the rest of the hospital. And we've certainly experienced that more than once. And we mentioned about don't rely on the IT department, because the IT department will assume that it's running antivirus and it's fully patched and up to date. And we often get ourselves into difficult conversations because not everybody understands the requirements of the medical devices. And then the other thing is guarding against staff rule violations and mistakes. People make mistakes on systems, so we use the firewall to mitigate against errors that people might make, or the rule violations. So people will log on to a CT scanner and try and connect to the internet or try and read their emails, despite the fact that they know fine well that they should not be doing that. And I mentioned about quickly reconfiguring during major incidents. This is my final point, and my final point really is from where I'm sat and the work that we've done. The only control that we really have over some of these devices and the way that they communicate with the outside world is these network firewalls. It's certainly our biggest form of defense here at Leeds. So on that note, I shall move into the Q&A sessions. So maybe, I don't know whether you've been monitoring the questions, Patrick. Maybe you could pick these up.
Sorry, I haven't been monitoring them.
Oh, sorry. Let me stop sharing. Here we go. So first question, would a Python coding program that works with QA data with imported libraries pose a cybersecurity threat? Do you want to reflect on that, Patrick?
Well, I'm not sure we've got enough time, to be honest. This could be a whole meeting in itself about Python coding. Yeah, Python coding and medical applications don't really go hand in hand. I mean, anything that's sitting on the network, yes, it would be a cybersecurity threat if it can become infected. Not necessarily the code itself, but the platform on which it sits would be vulnerable.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question then. So the next question is really about workforce planning. And I know that we've discussed this in the CSC SIG. It's about, do we really have the skills to, or is there enough people with the skills to manage these kind of threats? And I think that from where I'm sat, there's kind of two sides for this. I feel as a medical physics and clinical engineering community, we need to be more digitally literate. And I know we're very busy with everything and squeezing time in for this. It feels like, can we pass it over to somebody else? And from where I'm sat, no, because other people do not understand the risks. As soon as we start to bring other people in, if we hand over the responsibility, we end up with well, a misunderstanding and inappropriate management of some of the risks. It's got to be about collaboration. It's got to be about working together. But we do need better training, more trained people in the digital side of things. And certainly as AI is coming into play now, it's not something that as a profession we can ignore.
Yeah. And in terms of sort of workforce planning, I mean, the new clinical scientific computing STP curriculum is preparing those people for this kind of environment. However, there are too few places that can train these people. I know that last year we had 11 or 12 clinical scientific computing trainees. This year we've only got 5. And these are the sort of people who would be able to, lead on these issues.
Okay, question from Tom Lister. How secure is a firewall? You're absolutely right. Of course, a firewall can be hacked. I think certainly in the pragmatic end of things, what I'm seeing in my organization and other organizations is poor network segmentation and no protection of those segments. And I think what I'm trying to put across in my presentation is anything is better than nothing, and it's about what's pragmatically available to you. I think if your organizations have got very sophisticated networks, and there's certainly better tools than firewalls, it's just one approach. That's all I can say. Next question is kind of for you, Patrick. I guess it's about the password hack times.
To use 3 or more random words instead of random jumbles, which how do you rate security of this type of password? What security of the random jumbles? The problem is if you do it as a random jumble, your tendency is to write it down somewhere, and as soon as you write it down somewhere, then it becomes less secure. Which I guess leads on to the next issue, the one of password managers. Now we have implemented a password manager here because we do have to handle a lot of passwords. However, one thing we did have to do was we had to have a manual print of all the passwords, which we then secured stored in a secure location, because the password manager was on an IT system, and if the IT system fails, then you've lost all your passwords. So you do have to think about that situation. If you are using an online password manager, think about if that password manager goes away. I think it was 2 for the price of 1, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's always good. I'm just aware of time. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I just want to finish up with the wrap-up slide. So I'll do 1 or 2 more. So John Wilson, this shows the need for closer interaction or dedicated resources, either from digital services, workforce, clinical engineering. Again, I think I've said this, certainly from my perspective. I don't know what Patrick thinks. It's all about collaboration, and we have to work together. We've got to work with the IT department, work with our cybersecurity teams, work with our information governance teams, and collaborate on this. And part of our responsibilities is to try and educate them about the specific needs of medical devices.
Can't agree more, Bob. Absolutely.
Oh, easy. So we'll just do 1 more. We've talked about password managers. Comments. Don't reply on IT department controls when these particular IT departments are not doing their jobs adequately. Well, I come back to my collaboration point. It's about working together, and I feel that a big part of my job, I would suggest probably I spend 20% of my time collaborating with colleagues in various aspects of IT. But my approach is certainly not to say this is your job and this is my job, but just to work together, because I can't. There's so many other things going on with IT. Is to actually sit down and explain about the specific requirements of medical devices, and I think Patrick did a good job of explaining the range and the diversity of medical devices. We might be asking a bit much for IT to understand all of that, as well as everything else that's going on with their IT departments. I certainly don't take the approach that it's your fault or it's your job. I feel that we have to be taking that collaborative approach.
Yep. Collaboration is absolutely essential. Each person knowing the limitations of what they should be doing. Because the stuff that we bring to the table and the stuff that they bring to the table. So, yep. And, it depends if the IT people are just ignoring the issues and hoping they'll go away, because they won't.
Okay, so I just want to close off by talking about some related events. So we've got our next CSC webinar coming up on the 8th of July. I think you'll be seeing some communications around that, trying to encourage some early career presentations. Another webinar towards the end of the year, how to talk IT, and and that builds on the collaboration that we've just been talking about earlier on this presentation. And then we've got our CSC symposium, which is a whole day event. I'm hoping it's going to be here in Leeds, where I'm based, and that will be on the 21st of November 2024. So please keep your eyes open for that. And then just a plug for some other up and coming IPEM events. So an event at is that next week, 22nd of May? So about pulse oximeters, and then so RWRPA updates, MRI all at once. I did look at the agenda for this the other day. I thought it was an excellent meeting. Linac QA automation coming up in July, and then the STEF meeting, of course, the big event in October. I'm aware that we're 3 minutes over, so I think we should wrap up at that. Can I thank everyone for their questions, and thank Patrick for presentation, and also for IPEM for hosting this forum.
Chris is there. Go ask Chris. Not Chris Archer. Chris, no. Well, Chris Archer's lecturer.